talk about agriculture. Yes.
So far.
Okay.
I'm sure we're all just waiting.
Yep.
And so, John has an extensive background. He's a, as it says up there, he's a farm ranch management specialist. He's got a really incredible, wonderful program on how to keep laborers happy. And the first thing you got to do is you got to make sure they can work. And he's developed a special test to make sure that they'll work. I just made that up. John?
All right, well, thank you. I'll give you one of these too, so you can play along.
You bet.
Okay. Well, thank you for coming this morning, and we'll try to get through a few of the points that we have about ag labor, but certainly would be willing to take questions. If I can answer them, I will, or if I can't, I'll try to direct you to where we have some resources available to help get those answers. So what I have in mind to do this morning in the presentation is to try to give you some sort of a basic overview of how you might go about staffing farm business, some of the ins and outs of supervision as it says here, and then how to actually get ready to manage those employees, performance, and think a little bit about pay and benefits. And so I've got a few of these clicker questions, which is why I passed those out. And so I'll ask those as we go along through this deal. You basically push the button that corresponds to the answer. So this question asks, have you been involved in farming or ranching for less than 10 years, or are you ready to begin? Yes, no, or you're not sure.
You know what, I'm gonna interrupt you right here and I'm gonna leave. I wanna go to the production of the meat from
Okay.
County.
Fair enough.
I don't have anybody to hire, thank
Okay.
you. Now you can talk to him.
I'll talk to him. So ma'am, if I could have that clicker. Get that back from me. So if you push a button there,
Yeah, but I'm not sure how to answer that question.
have you been involved in farming or ranching for less than 10 years? No. So B. Okay. So no. Good. Have you owned a farm or ranch for less than 10 years? Yes, no, or you're not sure.
Hey,
Let's see.
or
Okay,
actually,
so we got split answers there. All right, so what we have this morning is a reference called Ag Help Wanted, which was put together several years back. I was part of that team, but there were folks from a number of other western states and one Canadian province that's contributed to the authorship of this book. And I'm going to go through some of the materials that are included in there, specifically 3 chapters that talk about staffing, supervising, and managing employees. And then at the end, if we have a little bit of time, I'll talk just briefly about what's in some of the other chapters. But it's a 250-page book that basically walks through nearly every angle of managing labor that you might think of encountering, and is a pretty good resource. So that's why we're going to talk about it. But before we get started, I'm curious what it is you see as some of the major labor management issues that you face. So we have staffing, supervising, managing, communicating with them, organizing, your business in terms of how they fit in with things, and or, your responsibilities and roles as an employer. So you can choose some of those, all of those, something other.
one thing is not on this,
Yeah.
it's in all of this. That is, what are the requirements for hiring immigrant workers?
Yeah, well, it is part of it, believe it or not, and we'll talk just briefly about started.
Okay,
That's a good point. So you can hit other there if you want, which is I. Just, I'll choose that one.
I mean, I think that one, the first one's really an important one, because from that, everything else feeds off of.
It does, although some people see it differently, so hold that thought, because we'll get back to it. But staffing. So here we're talking, and this is basically the list of the topics addressed in that particular chapter. We're talking about everywhere from, trying to decide who gets to work. So that may not seem like a big deal if you're you don't have any family members or you have a corporate type structure. But if you have family members and then you hire labor as well, trying to decide who has what roles, what responsibilities, mixing and matching those can be a real challenge in a family setting in particular. But how you go about actually the process of hiring, do you advertise and so on, and so on down through here, including the H-2A program and how that fits in, as well as assessing your applicants and then actually communicating the decision and orienting new employees. So it's a lot of material in this chapter. And so I'll just kind of quickly run through what is included in the chapter. One of the points of having this show up here is that the book itself is not just like a textbook. It actually has all kinds of boxes like this where it highlights different people's experiences. So, some of them are positive, some of them are negative, some of them are from the worker's perspective, some of them from the employer's perspective, just describing different situations and settings across Western agriculture and, that dynamic of working with employees and working with the people involved in both management as well as labor capacity. So it's helpful to have those because it kind of points out some of the stuff we're talking about. So in the next section, where we're looking at talking about how the process, in terms of the perspective of managing ag labor, really has got to focus on trying to improve the match, right? Trying to move from over here, maybe on the left, or maybe in the middle, of people may or may not work out so well, over to the right, where we're more sure that the people that we're bringing in are a good match with the jobs that we have in mind, not unlike what you said to begin with, right? That they can work and that they can help us accomplish the goals that we're trying to accomplish with the labor and with the operation in general, right? So in general, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to shift over here to the right, and so that things are a better match and that it's working better. So for us and the operation in total. And so, I've talked to a lot of people, not only in Wyoming, but around the West, about how they go about choosing ag labor. Probably, the guy I worked for 8 years had a great method. We hired whoever it is that walked on the place.
What?
We hired whoever it was that walked on the place, whether they were qualified or not. They may only last a day. They might have been there the whole season, but he didn't have a program. One of the best I've heard is from one of my colleagues who grew up on a family ranch. And he said that the way they got their summer labor is they went by the bus station in Cheyenne. And they might make a couple laps around the block, and then they decide which ones they were going to hit up and jump out and see if they needed a job. Well, that's kind of over here on the left-hand side, right? Whether that's a good match or not may not work out very well. And so what we're hoping to do, again, is kind of shift over here to the right side of the chart. And it probably, as it says, it's not going to be casual, but more of a formal approach, a more systematic way of trying to make people informed of what the opportunities are, and probably have them make application to the business, and then we try to match and decide whether they're going to fit up with what we have in mind. So it's more formalized, and some people aren't comfortable with that because it implies more management involvement, right? Something else you got to manage, something else you got to administrate. You might even have to tell some people no, that they can't work here because you don't want them to work here, right? Or that they're not going to be a good fit. And, that's supposed to help limit some of those car wrecks or you know, bad apples down the road. But not everybody, like I say, is comfortable with that because it takes more effort and it takes, you know, actually having to tell people things maybe they don't want to hear. If we were to lay out in the text of the book, Ag Help Wanted does go through a lot of steps in terms of how you might proceed through this more formalized process, all the way from kind of defining what it is you're looking for, you know, in terms of your laborers, you know, and actually doing some kind of a job description, and then, you know, moving through and thinking about interviewing, taking applications, interviewing, and then actually hiring and confirming and orienting those employees so that they can be successful once you've got them hired. And so in the text, again, it gives some examples of a number of these points. So here's an example of a job description. And toward the end of the presentation, I'll show you, I guess the handout I've given you gives you the URL to Ag Help Wanted. So the book is online, and it's interesting. There's a lot of different links in the text. And to go back and look at what it is, some of the stuff that people, since we published this book, are looking at online, this is the number one thing. It's a job description. A lot of employers apparently are looking for example job descriptions, and how do you go about laying this out? So I'm just saying that because it doesn't look like it's all that important. It doesn't even look like it'd be all that hard. But if you sit down to try to lay that out, it can be kind of challenging to think through. So what am I looking for? You know, and would I use, you know, it says qualifications here. Would I, you know, use some of these maybe as a point to decide whether somebody's a good match for what I have in mind or not? Because if you don't get it down on the piece of paper or the advertisement, it makes it a little more difficult to actually tell the candidate that, yeah, this is one of the things we're looking for, but we didn't put it down. I mean, you need to think this through, right, with that eye of, well, we're going to have maybe some, you know, a number of people here, and how are we going to sort them out? So the job description is a really important and key point to get laid out to begin with, because it kind of drives the process later on. Yeah? And, you know, again, here's that little story that's in the text. It tells about what kind of a difference that made. Lots of other examples are fascinating to read to me, I think. So, and then here's the process. Once you've got some candidates that have applied, how would you go through, you know, maybe the interview process, maybe some kind of a preliminary screening kind of a process, and then selecting maybe down to 3 or so that you think are the best match, and then doing an actual more in-depth interview, maybe check the references, and then, you know, maybe you'll have a couple of people involved in the decision making. It may not be just one person. In fact, I think in our text we actually recommend that you have, you know, the leadership of your operation involved. You may not be the only one supervising them, so to see the breadth of experience of those that have applied, to understand kind of what, you know, the pool looked like, as well as why we chose that person, can make it a little more understandable in working with that person once they're hired and down the road. So that's something else to think about, is just even the whole process. How are you going to run it? How are you going to involve other people in your operation in that, as well as the candidates? And so here's an example of how you might go through the interview. Actually, a set of suggested questions and how you might approach it. You know, at the university, it's highly rule-based. You're supposed to use exactly the same questions with every candidate, in part because that makes it fair, doesn't it? And so that might be a reason to do this if you're hiring an ag employee as well. Is to, you know, we're going to ask these 5 questions of every person, and then we'll compare how did they answer it. Is one way to do it. Not the only way, certainly, but it's something to think about. So that's a set of suggestions in the text. And then, you know, it doesn't seem like that big a deal, but how you go about communicating your decision about whether they are the one that you'd like to make the offer to, or they aren't the first choice. Maybe they're the second choice, or the third choice, or maybe further down the list. But you don't know, your first choice is going to say yes. And if they do, you know, that may not actually be good for you. I mean, it may look like that's the way you want it to go, but sometimes you need to go back to your pool. And at the university, that's one of the reasons we try to be fairly
consistent but also fair in the process, because sometimes the first choice says no, or they might start and they don't like it in an ag setting, and so to be able to go back to your second choice or your third choice and be able to offer without having to go through the whole thing all over again, you know, can save you time, and the people might actually appreciate that too. So how you communicate that, and you know how congenial you are, right? Nice is another way to put it, but it's important how you handle it. You don't just, I mean, you may not just want to say, well, you're no good, I don't want to have you work here. I mean, because you might, like I say, you might want to make him an offer to him in a month or something.
What you're saying here is really good, except for one thing.
What's that?
I don't see many people jumping to become agricultural workers today.
Not today. It is a challenging environment out there for all kinds of workers, you're right. And in ag, it is difficult, without a doubt. We don't have a lot of people that have experience anymore in agriculture. So a lot of times we're hiring from maybe even some other industry experience, right? It makes it challenging. And this points up why this next step is really important. They may have a lot of skills. They may have operated big equipment, for example, but not in an ag setting. They may have been around animals, horses, for example, but not around cattle or sheep. And how do they interact? So orienting those employees to try to give them the best chance for success makes sense not only for them, but for you too, as the employer, right? Because you want them to be successful, because that makes you successful. And so this is something I think we don't often spend a lot of time thinking about, is how do we actually bring the people into the workplace, describe the work, you know, give them the chance to interact with us, you know, whether it's to make a mistake and want to make it, you know, make up for it, or to try to ask us before some kind of a mistake is made, is clearly an important step in the process, if not to the success of everybody involved. So orienting, how do you go about doing that? And so these are some suggested categories that you might want to think about talking through with them in order to make them successful, like you say. So another one of these clicker questions here, what labor staffing issues do you find most challenging? So out of that whole kind of presentation there, topics about staffing, hiring, orienting, doing the interview, what do you think it is that's most challenging to you? Is it who gets to work? So trying to decide about family members, or to hire somebody from outside, how you go about approaching the selection and hiring process, steps in hiring, making the decision, orienting employees, some of those, all of them, or something else. If you wouldn't mind clicking on your clicker, one of those choices. Okay, so we've got several of us in here. We got a little difference of opinion. Assessing applicants, one or two of us said, orienting the employee, and then I think some of the above someone said. So a mixture of things. And it, you know, again, it depends. Some people have more experience having done this kind of a more formal process, and other people use a little more casual approach. You know, they may not, again, like the structure, but there are some things that can help not only the employee, but to make it a little more plausible that they're going to be successful once they start to work. Another aspect we haven't talked about, but you know, it might actually give you some protection on the legal side. Say they challenge how you did your process. Because if it's really casual and there's some kind of contention there, you know, in ag, we haven't had to be so worried about this over the years, but the more and more we become hiring from a pool of more broad workers out there, we leave ourselves open if we don't follow kind of a consistent and defensible process when we hire in agriculture as well. So some other reasons maybe to think about, kind of formalizing and using a little more structure. Question about anything in terms of staffing that we talked about?
One of the, and I'm just basing it on what I've observed, no research.
Okay.
But one of the big problems I see with my uncle and his ranches and neighbors they never explained very much. They had, you picked up by osmosis, and they know it all. They just don't explain it very well, or they don't explain it at all.
Or at all.
Right?
I understand. I worked for a guy that, for 8 years, I got to be able to read his mind perfectly. And I can give you an anecdote. I probably shouldn't go off script like this, but I tell it somewhat often. I made him so mad the last year I worked there that he took off. And it was a misunderstanding, but a difference of opinion as well. And so he took off and he didn't come back for 3 days.
You're joking.
And I was the foreman essentially. And so for 3 days, I had 1 or 2 guys that were working for us, and we did all these different things. I could run through a list of some of them. I still remember. It's been like 40 years ago, right? But he came back, and you know how we went over things. He'd be like checking his oil in his pickup truck or whatever, and you'd come up there and we'd be talking. So he was so mad. I don't know. He could barely talk to me even then after 3 days. But everything that he went through on his list of what we needed to worry about, I'd already done. And I just thought, yes, success, because I knew this is, you work with somebody like that, you pick it up that, oh, well, you're just supposed to know this stuff just by their comments or other ways that they interact with you. Well, if you're paying attention, you do. You pick a lot of it up. But it kind of blew me away that every single thing that he went through had already done. I picked up irrigation pipe in one place and moved it to another place, got it started. I'd gone and run some grain, and actually got the combine going down in this pad or this other field we had to move to, and harvested some. And I mean, we've just done all these things. We were really busy for 3 days. And I hear you. And that's not the best way to run it, because if you want people to do the job and you want them to do it in a certain particular way or a certain order, well, it's best to communicate it clearly to them. That way they have a chance to do it that way.
It's like work with cows. There are certain ways you should work with cows and others you should not. You don't pick that up just watching it.
No.
It'd be better if someone explained to you what those cows are going to be doing.
Yeah, because those people that aren't oriented, they tend to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, so that
Guilty as charged, yes.
So, okay, well, let's move on. We got a number of other pieces to cover here. So if you want to get people hired, well, then you have this other challenging thing of supervising. And, that seems pretty easy. You just tell them what you want to have done. Well, yeah, but you can't do that the first day of the season and then never talk to them again. You gotta interact with them, and it's best to do it periodically. And it's best to convey what it is you want to have done. And so these are the topics that are covered in this chapter. Talking about, so in some cases, a lot of agriculture has mid-level managers, right? There are people that are in charge of other people, or crews, and right? So whether it's a cow boss or a crew boss that's in charge of harvest or some other cultural operations, etc. So it talks about that, actually managing employees who are going to be supervising, talking about how you go about assigning the jobs, certain kinds of styles for both supervising and making decisions about how to do the leadership, but also leadership, actually encouraging people to do the right thing and so on. So again, I'm just going to kind of hit some of the high points, but thinking about, you as maybe the owner, or maybe you're this mid-level manager that's at this level, you've got other people that are under you, but there's some challenges, and depending on how many people you've got, there are different ways that you can approach it. And the text suggests some really, really interesting things that honestly I hadn't heard of. Some of my colleagues on the authorship list are out in California, so working with some really big farms that have a lot of employees. And it becomes a real challenge. But in the end, you still need to get the work done. And you still need to get it done on time and in a quality way, because that's success for the operation as a whole. And you hope that by doing that, those folks get rewarded either through the pay structure or there may be other incentive structures, but that they can see how they're contributing, and helping to make success for the operation as a whole.
See, you're talking about agricultural workers. Actually, this whole thing could be used anywhere.
You're right. It is clearly clearly possible, yep. But there are a lot of innuendos and subtleties that agriculture brings into the picture, just like your example a minute ago about livestock and managing cattle. I mean, you know, you wouldn't, I mean, just because you have to supervise labor, how you do that in that setting is a tricky deal. There's no doubt about it. In a lot of different ways people handle it or don't handle it, right? So delegating, and we talked about that a fair amount in here, you know, and thinking about how you plan that out, explain it to the employee, and again, thinking about you want it to be successful. So with certain workers, you know, you might use a more direct approach. With other people, especially if they're supervisors, you might, you know, go into a little more explanation, a little more detail, so that they can kind of get a feel for what the big picture is. So that again, they you know, maybe are encouraging to those people that are under them and so on. So it talks about, again, these styles and how you can move from telling, which is pretty direct, like you probably would do with your 7-year-old, right? Or your 10-year-old, which is a little different than, you know, if you've got a mid-level manager or somebody that's in charge of even other managers in your system, and you want them to feel good and you know, feel like they're making a contribution, you've got to handle it differently, let's face it, right? And if it's a long-term employee, even if you only have one employee, clearly you may want to be moving up towards this higher level of how you work with those folks and interact with them. So there's this scale that we present in the text, and it's a philosophical point, but I think it's helpful to a lot of people in ag to think about this, probably in the wintertime, not in the midst of the busy season, but you know, how am I going to approach it? And could I do a little better? Going from, again, approaches that are more coercive or authoritative to coaching, and you know, thinking about in more of a pace setting, or you know, trying to encourage them to be leaders and to move and inspire maybe other folks that are involved in the operation. So again, just trying to think about how it is that you handle leadership as a particular function in your business, as well as power. Because let's face it, if you have people that are in charge of other people, they have power, and that needs to be handled carefully and judiciously, so that not only will the people be inspired that are supposed to be the workers, but also that you don't get in trouble legally. Because again, you know, this is an issue that, again, other industries have had to deal with, but in ag, I think we've got to be careful about it.
I want to tell you a funny story. It's my cousin. She does in coding. She did. She's deceased now, but she worked for a unnamed business there, and the owner of that business every 2 weeks took the check that was made out to them, went over to that employee and said, "Jim, I really appreciate what you did for this last 2 weeks. I couldn't have done it without you." They would work 15, 20 minutes overtime just because they were appreciated.
Yeah.
Okay, I mean, they were very loyal to that owner.
And you know, I guess I'm not a big one to be just saying, well, you should just do that because it's the right thing.
Yeah.
It needs to be sincere.
Yes.
People know whether you're sincere.
Absolutely.
But if you are sincere, let's face it, that buys things that money just can't buy.
That's right.
Loyalty and a willing to put up with things, you know, and to stay late or to work harder, even if the pay doesn't compensate. I mean, it just goes miles to appreciate folks. So I can't second that any more than that, but it's important to treat people well, and they recognize whether you're doing it, whether you do or not, right? I mean, you may not even realize how you're doing it, but they know. And so that's part of what we're talking about here, without a doubt. And you know, in a business where you have supervisors, how you manage them clearly is going to be a little different than how you manage workers and those that are in the trenches doing the tasks that need doing. And so to challenge you to think a little about that, maybe organizing your workers into teams or crews and rewarding them with some incentives that's a little different than other crews. That can create some challenges as well, where you get into competitions and some people trying to sabotage the work of other crews. I mean, there's some things I've heard about you don't want to know about, but that happens too. And if you're going to do this successfully, you've got to know about some of that stuff. And so that's kind of the end of that that chapter, the next chapter, keep moving here, is about managing folks. So not only do you have to supervise them and coach them and or give them input about how they're doing, but every once in a while you need to give them some feedback about how they're doing. You may need to evaluate their performance. You may actually need to adjust their pay, not like the guy I worked for who only ever wanted to talk about it when I made it an issue. And he didn't want to talk about it then, in fact didn't want to increase it, but he did often in those 8 years I was there, to his credit, and you know, I'm not sorry. He put me through college, and I'm not, I gained so much experience, but it was not easy every day either, as you may have picked up. But you know, talking about other kinds of rewards, whether they're benefit programs, and so on, and then, you know, assessing that performance and actually giving them formalized feedback. So that's what we'll talk about a little bit here, is trying to think about, you know, how do you handle that? Is that something that you've thought of, that you're actually managing their performance? Or you just hope when you go to work every day that they do what they're supposed to do and that they don't create issues for you, you know? I mean, it just doesn't foster that kind of a team spirit or a sense of appreciation like you would hope you would do if you want to keep them around. And, you know, this day and age, you can't really afford to have people moving on like we used to be able to do because somebody else will follow them in. That isn't necessarily the case. So you probably want to be successful in your business and you want your employees to be successful. You need to think about bringing people in and then building their capacity and, you know, actually rewarding that in some kind of a cycle, right? That you retain those folks and that you know, hopefully keep them around and that not only to your benefit, but also for theirs as well. So this talks in this section about how you're trying to move people forward and recognizing those that can't move forward because of some reasons, right? There are some people that they don't know and they don't care to know, and some people will say they can't do it, and some people are actually just trying to draw a paycheck and they aren't going to do what it is you're maybe going to ask them to do. That makes it challenging, but you need to give them the chance. So on the ability side, you actually need to say, well, you know, you might have thought about this in the interview, obviously, but as you bring them into the workplace, you may have some new opportunities for them to move into and so on, but they may not have the aptitude for it. How do you handle it? You might actually train them. You know, it may be a program like we got going today at Farm and Ranch Days, or other kinds of training programs that might allow them to gain skills. And if that's true, or you may be able to offer some of the training, how they learn makes a difference in terms of whether they learn it from you, right, or from someone else. If they can hear it as an auditory kind of an experience, if you can tell them and they can learn it, great. But some people need to be shown. You know, we may need to walk it through. I may need to ride the tractor with you for a couple of rounds, that kind of thing. Or, you know, ride beside you on that other horse, and I'll show you where you should be when we're moving cows up through this paddock, or we're going to move them through that gate, or bring them into the corrals, whatever. You know, so that you can think about that. Instead of just assuming everybody is going to hear what I say and they'll just know instantly. So thinking about that as well as the motivation. You know, some people are self-motivated, as it talks about here. Other people need some incentives. They need to be encouraged. They need to be, you know, appreciated, maybe, we talked about. And so there's this whole scale, and all of us are like this, one way or another. Some of us in workplace, some of us in our, you know, in our leisure time, some of us in other aspects of our lives that, you know, you should recognize that we aren't all the same in every situation, and not everybody's the same in the workplace. So it's kind of an important, it's a human resource thing. Some people don't like to think about that, but you know, for some of us, there are certain things that build us up. And so it says good pay, you know, that's probably the one we think of first. If you pay me well, but you know, being valued, being trusted, you valued me enough to give me some training, you know, that might build me up. As opposed to how you treated me yesterday showed that you don't trust me very much. You're just confused, or you know, you like to act like I don't know what I'm doing, etc. You don't listen to me. You've given me a job that it doesn't challenge me at all. I'm bored all the time. There's just certain things that are going to basically draw you down as a worker. and as a supervisor as well. So, it's just kind of recognizing how do you manage the work environment and or how you interact with those people about their job makes a difference. Clearly, pay and performance is an important component, and it needs to be thought about in terms of outside, right? So what does the neighbor pay for the same kind of work? It needs to have, if you have multiple employees, and a lot of us in Wyoming don't, but especially like these California operations, if a tractor driver on this farm, is paid such and such, but on this other farm, and growing, say, beets versus hay, would be an example from Wyoming. But we pay more for tractor drivers in that other farm. Well, the tractor drivers get to talking to each other, and so there needs to be some kind of internal equity as well. Is there a basis? Is it consistent? And so on. Is there, other kinds of non-pay benefits and so on? And how do you communicate that? Is it posted? Sometimes being transparent is a great way to keep the rumor mill not functioning, and that people can talk all they want, but it's posted right there where they draw their paycheck, and maybe you're open about it. I mean, there are a number of these things that seem like, oh yeah, whatever, but they can make a big difference in the environment that you create that the workers are operating in.
So I just was thinking about something when you were saying that. Well, it'd be really neat if you could set up a time, say once every 2 weeks, we sit down and say, okay, what could we have done better at this? And you got any ideas of how we have done this job better? And how can I use that employee's skills in other ways to help in this area?
Yep, and as a supervisor, that's a great technique I've heard of used, is that you go and as they're working, go out amongst them and consult with them a little bit, right? They feel valued, that you see their opinions worth something, and you may actually learn something. That they're disgruntled about this point,
Absolutely.
or that they wish that you could have been a little more flexible with time off, or something, because you're out there in the hayfield, whatever. They're willing to say something instead of being in the meeting in front of everybody else. So there's some approach things that can make a difference.
One thing that's very important is to always be consistent.
Yep.
That's the most. You
Yeah.
start saying this one day and another time,
Get in trouble pretty
you've lost it.
Yep, good points. So that's about a pay scale. Benefits, is probably fairly obvious, but there's lots of ways to get benefits. It doesn't have to be retirement per se, but like I just mentioned, flexibility and time off, or for sick leave, for example, for family members or something, or opportunities to get training, for example. We always go to farm and ranch days as a crew. I've had people come to meetings that I've done, and they, that's just a value of the manager. He wants his people to gain that knowledge as well. So there's a lot of different things you can think about that don't really cost you much in terms of dollars, but it makes a big difference to the people that are involved. Assessing the performance. That gets a little more tricky. Again, probably talking about in a formalized process. A big deal at the university. I'm not really excited about it. Actually just went through putting my packet together for review this end of this last year for the 5th or 6th time in my career, and I don't like it. I mean, it just seemed like a complete waste of time. But how are people going to know what you're doing if you don't document it? How's your supervisor supposed to, give you effective feedback if you don't sit down and talk about the job in a kind of a formalized way and discuss what do we see as going well? It doesn't have to be all negative. And what is it that we might do to help things go better? And you could do this every year. You don't necessarily have to do it, but pretty frequently is a good idea, especially if you want to keep people around and that you value, because they notice that you're interacting with them at that kind of a personal level, and if you're asking them questions about the job and the workplace for their input, and you may actually, like I said earlier, gain from that, may implement some new strategies or whatever, they notice that too. Let's face it. So. This also can give you some legal backing should things go south at some point. Again, I hate to keep bringing that up, but we face liability on a lot of different fronts in ag these days, and if we don't pay attention to some of it, we could get caught. I've heard of some, a number of stories that people have been caught up on this, and so something to pay attention to. I don't have a recommendation particularly, other than you may just want to think about it, how you're handling it. So again, another set of stories here of describing how that might work. You know, some people like to use scale kind of approaches, so they have a duty that they spell out on an evaluation form, and they may, you know, actually assign a score. And then some people will use this and have the employee fill it out as well, and then you come together as a point of discussion. I've had to go through with some of this kind of systems at the university. I didn't like that too much, but honestly, it's a tricky thing. And I understand it's tricky for the employee as well as the supervisor, because nobody really likes to do this, but it's important to do as a job function and a periodic thing to try to help people move forward with their jobs as well as for the organization as a whole. So in terms of supervision, what issues do you think are more challenging for folks these days? Is it trying to assign the work, delegation, enabling those folks to do well, motivation, pay, benefits, some of the above, all of the above? What do you guys think? So we got, looks like several of us, or all of us, maybe said some of the above. Because it really is a mix. It kind of depends on which year, which situation. There are challenges. Certainly as you look out there, different people face different kinds of challenges in this day and age, as well as we're moving forward, challenging to get folks in and so on into the business. So, you know, this is kind of about trying to keep people in many ways. Get them hired, that's one thing. And if they're doing the work, that's another good thing. But keeping them, this is kind of a point of helping to value, you know, them to be feeling valued, but to also set them up for success going forward. If they better understand what you're after, what kinds of things you're thinking about that they could do that help, you know, make things go better or be more successful for the business, so on. So it requires a kind of a discussion, an ongoing conversation. And you can do that daily or, you know, periodically, but it is something to think about, maybe doing it on an annual basis and having a record and, you know, putting that aside. So it's, again, just kind of a challenge.
If I could just interrupt for a second. There's been a real change in workers' attitudes recently because of the labor shortage. Okay? Used to be, there were studies showed that the reason why people were satisfied with their jobs was because the relationships they had with other employees. Now, it's not that anymore. The most important factor, at least in some studies, is pay.
Yeah, pay. Yep, so, you know, clearly we face a lot of different challenges in ag settings with workers not necessarily doing the work that we'd like them to do. And so it's a fascinating piece of the creation of Ag Help Wanted as a textbook that my colleagues in California had assembled a whole bunch of footage of different problem work situations and how to handle it. And we have posted all of this to the website. aghelpwanted.org is the URL. It's on the handout I gave you. But it sets up these different scenarios. I think there's 7 different ones here. It's 9 different ones, I guess. And then it has different ways that you could handle it. So tardiness, so somebody comes late to work, so it has a scene, plays out, somebody's late to work. And then it stops. And then you can go and click, which way do you handle it? So avoidance, you just don't pay any attention to it. You give them a warning, you know, come back, come do that one more time. Or you give them an explanation of how when they're late to work, you know that this drags the whole crew down and hurts our performance for the day, et cetera, et cetera. So there's different ways, and you can see there's a mixture of different ways that they've handled them, and it's kind of a fascinating thing. So if people, we recommend, you know, if you face some of these kind of challenges and are not sure how to handle it, well, you might want to take a look at these. They're free. You just go on the internet, you click them, and they're short little clips, and it may give you some ideas. There's some written material that goes with it as well, describes, you know, some things that you can read, and it may give you some ideas about how to handle this. This whole business of managing ag labor, from staffing, hiring, and so on, through to giving them feedback about their work performance, really is about managing the risk of the operation, in particular the human risk side of things. And it is a risk. You need to, and it's terrible to have to keep bringing up these different sources of risk, but this is an area we haven't had to be so formalized about in the past, and is a challenge for us currently, and I think we've got to tighten that up. So it's wonderful to have this reference to draw from. Again, a book that addresses across six different chapters here, sort of the gamut of things you've got to worry about in terms of managing ag labor. And it is available on the web. You can click through and look at specific sections, but you can only look at just really tiny sections on purpose because we're trying to sell the book. But it has links on the web page to different examples. So like we talked about the job description earlier, but different required forms and posters, some different articles, links to some of those public agencies about, that manage some of those dimensions of regulation about ag labor and so on. So you can check that out. Your handout gives you some stuff that we put together recently, highlights of some of the chapters as well as updates of specific things, Fair Labor Standards Act, and some of the other changes in regulations have been highlighted. Those are all on the web as well. I think we have almost all of them on the table out here if you want to pick those up in a printed form. So you certainly can order a copy of the book online if you want, or if you would prefer, I've got a sign-up sheet, and if you want to fill this out, I'll send you a copy in the mail at no charge, but you got to fill out the sign-up sheet. So now, in the way of evaluation, since I'm out of time, was this presentation on ag labor useful to you? You can completely agree, you can agree, or there are some other choices available there should you feel compelled to use one of those. Thank you for your input. Is there something out of the presentation that you might apply, do you think, going forward? So if you think you might apply something, you can completely agree. You can say you're not sure. You can even disagree if you like. But something that you might think you apply out of the presentation. And is there any of those issues that we've kind of run through here that you think you'd like to have a little more help with? From roles and responsibilities to supervising, staffing, some of the above, all of the above, or other, I guess, is another choice there. Moving forward on that. So the final point I wanted to make this morning is we have a program. I've got handouts on the table right outside the door here that we're just getting started, and it includes some educational programs that we've got going on, some of them online, some in person, but we're creating an internship program. And we are currently taking applications for interns. We have funding for upwards of 10 interns around the state at this coming summer. And we're basically at the point of taking applications for both hosting operations that want to host an intern, as well as from young people that might want to go and be an intern at one of those places. At the end of the month is the deadline in February, and so starting early in March, we're hoping to take those applications and try to match people up with operations and run that program over this next summer. So far, we've had a great response. If you know of people that might be interested in this, or you yourself would like to make an application, you can do that online at this growing-wy.org. If you want to pick up some of those handouts, or again, if you want to send somebody that, I'd encourage you to do that, because we're trying to get as many people involved as we can. Currently, I think we have something like over 20 applications currently pending, so I'm really excited. We've only been offering it for about 2.5 weeks or thereabouts, so we got a few more weeks to go before the end of February, but I would be happy to take applications from anybody that has an interest. So we really encourage you to kind of spread the word about that. And I guess I'm curious, thank you for your attention. Any final questions or suggestions on this topic, ag labor management, or anything else we brought up? So we had a few stories along